We know Professor Moriarty as Sherlock Holmes's nemesis. He's described in the novel The Valley of Fear as a latter-day Jonathon Wild. And today, we're going to look at the life of Wild, who was one of London's most ruthless and cunning criminals. Indeed, Moriarty is described in the stories as the Napoleon of crime and the organiser of half that is evil and nearly all that is undetected in this city. This is the real story of Jonathon Wild, the man behind the legend of Moriarty. Hi, and welcome back to the Historical Crimes and Criminals podcast. I'm Steve, your host. And I'm going to end this series with a 3-part episode. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle drew many of his characters, traits, and stories from real-life people and criminal stories that he read in the newspaper. Sherlock Holmes' deductive skills were based on his former medical lecturer in Edinburgh, Joseph Bell. And as a young medical student, Conan Doyle watched and later in life described the following interaction between Bell and a patient he'd only just met. "Well, man, you've served in the army." "Aye, sir." "Not long discharged." "No, sir." "A Highland regiment?" "Aye, sir." "An officer?" "Aye, sir." "Stationed in Barbados?" "Aye, sir." The scene has all the familiar hallmarks of every Sherlock tale and stunned the medical students who believed it to be trickery until it was explained by Bell as the following. The man was respectful but did not remove his hat. They do not do that in the army, and he would have if he'd relearned civilian ways had been long discharged. As for the officer in the Highland Regiment, he was obviously Scottish, and he also had an air of authority. As to Barbados, he had elephantitis, which is obviously West Indian and not British. And our tale starts in England in the year 1682. This is the year we see the building of Downing Street, which would become the residence of British Prime Ministers since the early 18th century. The good King Charles II is on the throne with only 3 years left of his 25-year royal restoration romp. Charles was a Protestant king, England a relatively newly Protestant country, and the burning of heretics, although last practised in England in 1612, were still in living memory, and it's fair to say Catholics and Catholicism weren't popular, as we remember from our Guy Fawkes episode. Charles's most famous mistress was of course my favourite, Nell Gwynn, but another of his mistresses was Louise de Querelle, to whom Charles had gifted the title Duchess of Portsmouth. But the Duchess of Portsmouth's Catholicism made her unpopular with people, and it was whilst Nell was riding through Oxford in a coach in 1681, she was reputed mobbed by an angry crowd who thought that the coach contained the Duchess. It was therefore just angry screams of "You Catholic whore!" that Nell gently leaned out of the coach window and reassured the crowd by saying, "Very good people, be silent, for I am his Protestant whore." And today's story comes from the Newgate Calendar, although I've had to heavily edit it for our modern ears. I've tried to keep the original syntax of the story. Jonathon Wild was born in Wolverhampton in the year 1682. He was the eldest son of his parents. He attended school where he learned to read and write, and at the age of 15, he was apprenticed for 7 years to a bucklemaker in Birmingham. Upon completion, he returned to Wolverhampton, married a young woman, and gained a living working at bucklemaking. 2 years later, his wife gave birth to a son, and he then deserted his wife and child and set out for London, where he got into employment, maintained himself by his trade. But being, however, because of his extravagant lifestyle, in 1710, he was arrested for debt and thrown into Wood Street Compter. Whilst in the Compter, Wild made acquaintance with his fellow captives and listened to accounts of their exploits with envy. In this prison was a woman named Mary Milner, who had been both a prostitute and a pickpocket. A relationship blossomed between Mary and Wild, and when they obtained their freedom, they lived together as common-in-law man and wife. And by various nefarious practices, they quickly obtained money, which enabled them to open a little public house in Cock Alley, facing Cripplegate Church. As Mary was acquainted with most of the depraved characters by whom London was infested, she was considered by Wild as a most useful companion, and indeed, she certainly contributed him to become one of the most accomplished villains in London criminal history. He got to know the secrets of criminals of every description who visited his public house, which quickly became the place to go to dispose of their ill-gotten gains. Jonathon took the articles brought to him by thieves at less than their read value, but no law existed in this period for the punishment of receivers of stolen goods. But the number of thefts in London increased to such a degree that it was deemed expedient to pass laws for its suppression of receivers like Wild. And subsequently, an act was passed consigning anyone receiving goods, knowing them to have been stolen, to be transported for 14 years. Wild's practices had been interrupted by this law, but only slightly, and he adopted the following plan. He called a meeting of all the local thieves and pointed out that if they took their goods to the pawnbrokers, they would only receive 1/4 of the real value. He informed them he had devised a plan and recommended them to follow his advice. And he proposed that when they had stolen items, they should deliver it to him instead of taking it to the pawnbroker, saying he would restore the goods to the owners. They could then all collect a reward, whilst the thieves would remain perfectly secure from detection. The proposal was received with general agreement, and it was resolved by all to carry it out with immediate execution. All of the stolen effects were to be given to the possession of Wild, who soon appointed places where they were to be hidden away from his own pub. The plan thus commenced. It became the business of Wild to apply to the persons who had been robbed, pretending to be greatly concerned at their misfortunes, saying that the stolen item had been found by a very honest man, a pawnbroker, with whom he was acquainted, and that, if their goods happened to be in the hands of his friend, a return of the goods could be made for a reward. Happy in the prospect of regaining their property, people approved of Wild, and sometimes also rewarded him even with one half of the real value of the goods restored. This on top of what he received from the thieves. And as Wild received in his own name no money directly from the owners of stolen goods, but deducted his profit from the money which was to be paid to the broker, he amassed considerable funds without danger of prosecution. He was clever, as his offences came under no laws. And as Wild's business increased, his name became better known, and he altered his mode of action. Instead of writing directly to parties who'd been plundered, he then opened an office to which many people applied to in hopes of recovering their stolen goods. When people came to his office, they were informed they must each pay a crown in consideration of receiving his advice. And with this ceremony being dispatched, he entered in his book the name and address of applicants, with all the particulars they could communicate respecting the robberies and the rewards which would be given provided the goods were recovered. They were then desired to call again in a few days, when he hoped he should be able to give them some agreeable intelligence. And upon returning to know the success of his inquiries, he told them he had received some information concerning their goods, and when he ascertained and negotiated the best sum that was likely to be given for the recovery of the property, he requested its owners to apply at a particular time and goods would be ready for delivery. And now, goods which had before considered as little use but to the owners now became matters claiming particular attention from the thieves. Pocketbooks, account books, and various personal items would be targeted as they held undisputed value that could not be replaced by their owners. But Wild's relationship with Mary Milner had soured, and one day she provoked him, and he punished her by cutting off one of her ears. This event was the cause of their separation, but in acknowledgement of her services, he continued to pay her a weekly allowance. Charles Hitchin was the official city marshal. He was a man as corrupt as Wild, and Hitchin used his position as under-marshal to practice extortion. He had purchased the position in 1712 for £700, or almost £100,000 in today's money, which, despite this, was a hugely profitable business, as amongst various enterprises, he pressured brothels and pickpockets to pay him off or give him stolen goods. Hitchin was also a homosexual and coerced sexual favours from the Molly houses. But Hitchin was in trouble. His employers, the Court of Aldermen, were presented with lots of complaints from different members of the public about Hitchin's doings. The court did not show much willingness to investigate the marshal's case, since the post was usually sold as mentioned above. Hitchin's utter discharge would cause a devaluation. It would not be easy, if possible at all, to sell the office, known in advance one could lose it before receiving the value for it. Therefore, the alderman adopted a cautious and neglectful approach. However, due to the seriousness of some of these complaints, and a letter sent to the retiring Lord Mayor, Sir Gilbert Heathcote, by Hitchin's accusers, reminding him of the 1706 statute and its severe penalties for receiving, a committee under the retiring mayor was appointed to examine the case. And by 27th of October 1713, there had already been 10 testimonies, all of which involved Hitchin as a receiver of stolen goods. The Lord Mayor suspended him from his post. And Hitchin, in order to remedy this situation, he determined as the most prudent step to team up with the competition, namely Wild. To this effect, he wrote him a letter as follows: "I'm very sensible that you are let into the knowledge of the secrets of the Compter, particularly with relation to securing your pocketbooks, but your experience is inferior to mine's. I can put you in a far better method than you're acquainted with, which may be done with safety, for although I'm suspended, I still retain the power of acting as constable. But I must first tell you that you spoil the trade of thief-taking in advancing greater rewards than are necessary. I give but £0.50 a book, but when the thieves and the pickpockets see you and I together, they will submit to our terms and likewise continue their thefts for fear of going to the gallows by our say-so. You shall take a walk with me as my servant or assistant, and we'll commence our rambles this night." Wild accepted the ex-marshal's proposal. After all, for every felon caught and tried, they received £40. Moreover, Wild saw the advantages of this position, and he would also get an insight into Hitchin's practices. So, after dark, they proceeded to Temple Bar, called upon several brandy shops and alehouses between that and Fleet Ditch. Some of those masters of these houses complimented the marshal with punch, others with brandy, some presenting him with fine ale, offering their service to their protector. Hitchin gave them to understand all the service he expected from them was to give them information of pocketbooks or any stolen goods as a payback. "I'll give you my word, both they and you shall be detected unless you deliver all the pocketbooks to me. What do you think I bought my place for but to make the most of it? And you are to understand, this is my man," pointing at Wild, "to assist me. And if, at any time for the future, you refuse to give up the watches or books, either me or my servant, you will be assured of going to jail, and not one of you shall be permitted to walk the streets any longer." And a few nights later, walking near St. Paul's, Hitchin said to Wild, "I will now show you a brandy shop that entertains no company but whores and thieves. This is a house for our purpose. I'm informed that a woman who frequents it has lately robbed a gentleman of his watch and pocketbook." And upon finding the woman and demanding the goods, the woman asked Hitchin what he would give for the watch, this being £7 or £8 in value, and the pocketbook having in it various notes. Hitchin answered a guinea and told her it was better to comply than go to Newgate. The woman replied that the watch was in pawn for 40 shillings. He allowed her 30 shillings for the watch and the book, which she reluctantly accepted. The watch was given to Hitchin and never returned to its owner. Sometime later, another gentleman lost his watch while in the company of a well-known female pickpocket. He spoke to Hitchin, desiring his assistance. Hitchin and Wild tracked down the pickpocket and gained a confession. She declared that she had stolen the watch and had taken it to a woman who kept a brandy shop near, asking her to assist in the sale of it. On further investigation, the mistress of the brandy shop had then sold the watch to a watchmaker. This story seemed reasonable, and the watchmaker had indeed purchased the watch and given 50 shillings for it. Hitchin told the watchmaker it was stolen goods, he should hand over the watch. But the watchmaker, who was not accustomed to this type of intimidation, answered that he had bought the watch, and if it had been stolen, they should be looking for the thief Hitchin replied he had no interest with the person that stole the property, but with him whose possession it was found, and if he didn't hand over the watch and give it without insisting upon any money, he would send him to Newgate. And the frightened watchmaker surrendered the watch, and also made a present to Hitchin of 3 guineas for his trouble. And there, it was no wonder why Hitchin was so keen on retaining his position, for Wild would eye this lucrative enterprise. But they both still worked independently and were rivals, as seen in the next story. A biscuit maker near Wapping lost a pocketbook wherein, amongst other papers, was a note bill for £100. He applied to Wild for the recovery. Wild advised him to advertise it and stop the payment of the bill, which he did accordingly. But having no further news of his property, he came back to Wild and told him that he'd received a visit from a tall man with a sword, calling himself the city marshal, who asked him if he had lost a pocketbook. The biscuit maker answered yes, and desiring to know his reasons for putting such a question, or whether he could give him any intelligence, he replied no, he could not think of any intelligence of it as yet, but wished to be informed whether he'd employed any other person to search for it. The biscuit maker answered he'd employed Mr. Wild. Hitchin told him he was under a mistake. He should have applied to him, who was the only person in England that could serve him, being well assured it was entirely out of the power of Wild to know where the pocketbook was, and begged to know the reward that would be given. The biscuit maker replied he would give £10. The marshal said a greater reward should be offered than that. If they'd employed him at the beginning and offered £40 or £50, he would have found his pocketbook. The biscuit maker then told Wild this story, and the latter gave his opinion that the pocketbook was in the marshal's possession, and there would be no purpose to continue advertising it. He was well assured that the marshal would have taken pains to find out the biscuit maker, unless he also knew how to get at it. So Wild went to Hitchin and bid £40 for his pocketbook and bill. "Sir," said Hitchin, "you're too late." They had been sold on and were never traced. A short time later, one of the young pickpockets under Hitchin told Wild he'd sold the pocketbook with the £100 exchequer note in it and other bills to Hitchin at his tavern in Aldersgate Street for 4 or 5 guineas. A person was standing in the pillory near Charing Cross when a gentleman watching in the crowd had his pocketbook stolen, which had bills and lottery tickets the value of £200. A reward of £30 was first offered for it in a public advertisement, and Hitchin suspected that a famous pickpocket, known by his distinctive lame hand, had taken the book. He found him, and to enforce a confession, Hitchin told him he'd been described by the gentleman to have been near him and whom he was certain had stolen his book. "In short," says he, "you had the book, and you must bring it to me, and you shall share the reward. But if you refuse to comply with these terms, you must never expect to come within the city gates, for if you do, Newgate shall be your residence." Hitchin's pickpocket did not deny that he had the pocketbook, but he said to the marshal, "I do not expect this treatment for you after all the services I've done for you in concealing for you several times, and by that means keeping you out of jail. It's not the way to expect any future service." But Hitchin still insisted upon what he had first proposed, and at length the pickpocket, considering he could not operate in London, without Hitchin's consent, and fearing the revenge, decided it would be prudent to part with the pocketbook if he could negotiate a good price. Hitchin then told him, "I lost all my money last night at gaming, except a gold watch in my pocket. I'll exchange goods for goods with you." So the pickpocket, rather than what he would risk the consequences, concluded a bargain. One night near Fleet Street, Hitchin and Wild met a gang of pickpocket boys who instantly, at the sight of Hitchin, ran away. Hitchin and Wild took after them, Hitchin explaining, "They were to have met me in the fields this morning with a book I'm informed they have taken from a gentleman. There is Jack Jones amongst them." Jack Jones, hiding behind a coach to make his escape, was then taken by Hitchin and Wild. They carried him to a tavern and threatened him, telling him he believed them housebreakers and that they were part of a burglary lately committed by 4 young criminals. This happened to be the fact, and the boy, fearing the marshal had been informed of it for his own security, confessed, and the marshal promised to save his life on his becoming evidence. Hitchin then committed the boy to the compter till the next morning and carried him before the magistrate, who took his information and issued a warrant for his companions. Given information where the criminals were likely to be found, Hitchin and Wild went to a house in Beach Lane. They listened at the door, and they overheard the boys, with several others. They later returned with 8 or 10 watchmen and a constable, apprehended 2 of the pickpockets below the age of 12 years. The boys were committed to Newgate, but the fact of the crime having been perpetrated in the county of Surrey, they were afterwards removed to the Marshallee prison. Jack Jones then gave evidence against his former friends before the trial, and the marshal endorsed his name on the back of it to have the honour of being evidence against these notorious housebreakers. However, at the trial, the parents of the offenders appeared and testified to court that Hitchin was the cause of the ruin of these boys by encouraging them in the stealing of the pocketbooks. The judge gave his opinion that Hitchin's actions were more to get the reward than do justice, and he summed up the charge to the jury in the favour of the boys, who were therefore acquitted, and the marshal reprimanded. Hitchin and Wild then went their separate ways in 1714, with each pursuing their criminal activities. Wild moving to an office in the Blue Boar Tavern on the Old Bailey. Wild continued to call himself Hitchin's deputy, entirely without any official standing, and took to carrying a sword as a mark of his supposed authority. With his criminal activities, Wild was becoming more powerful each year, to the alarm of Hitchin. And so the story went on with the rival, but the eventual downfall of Hitchin's was pretty much his own doing. In 1718, Hitchin attempted to expose Wild's deeds, arranging the publication of a true discovery of the conduct of receivers and thief-takers in and about the city of London. There, he named Wild as a manager and a source of crime. It caused a tit-for-tat paper war erupting, culminating with Wild's an answer to the late insolent libel, and he outed Hitchin publicly as a homosexual who visited and coerced molly houses. This subsequently ruined Hitchin's reputation and left Wild free to pursue his criminal enterprises. And as for the Hitchin story, a downward trajectory, and in 1727 a trial was held at the Old Bailey in which Hitchin was indicted for an assault with sodomy. He was found guilty of sodomitical practices, and Hitchin was fined £20 and sentenced to 6 months imprisonment and standing in the pillory near the Strand. The newspapers announced his sentence, and such was a long hatred of him that when standing in the pillory, he received such verbal and physical abuse from people throwing stones that he was taken down early, having sustained severe wounds. And Hitchin died a month later at the age of 52. Well, that's it for part 1 of the story of Jonathon Wild. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please subscribe, and if you haven't already done it, please do take time to leave a review, and also tell your friends and give me a little shout out on your Twitter, Facebook, or wherever. And till next time, bye bye.